Section 5, we're going to cover Active Directory stuff at a high level. This module is going to be very difficult to learn conceptually, let alone teach. I'm going to do my best, try and mention everything, the high takeaways that you should have from the concepts being displayed, but you can really make an entire career out of this one section alone, just being someone who really understands Windows Active Directory and go off to be a Windows administrator. Maybe just do your whole career managing identities and assets as they relate to what you're controlling in Active Directory, managing GPOs, managing users, etc. It's a section that we're going to do our best to cover, kind of the important stuff as it relates to Active Directory, but this one is going to require a lot of independent research outside of the concepts that we're about to touch on. But at a high level, I think we're going to cover it just fine here. So, a note on LDAP. It's often used in conjunction with Microsoft Active Directory. It's the directory service used by Windows-based computers to manage resources, authenticate users. Active Directory is built on top of LDAP. We've touched on this briefly, but we'll go into a little bit more depth on what it is. It's a standardized protocol used to access and manage directory services over a network, commonly used by organizations to manage user accounts, groups, and resources in a centralized directory. So kind of the buzzwords here for LDAP, it's basically going to be a large directory. It's going to be pretty much an index of all of the information that you have, and we want to be able to query. We want to be able to query the information within our large directory or index or, phone book, it's commonly referred to, for all of the information for identities and assets that we have in our large environment. It's basically going to create an index for us to query and work with for accessing the data. The other buzzword, hierarchical. Don't know how to spell that, but hierarchical. So like DNS, LDAP is also hierarchical. It's going to work from the top down to start resolving the query that you're performing or the information that you need to come from this large directory or index. And there's going to be different names and values associated with the hierarchical structure. So it uses X500 distinguished names, and that just came from a standard of a telecom industry or something that decided this is the way we're going to structure this hierarchical index, and we're going to use X500 distinguished names. The distinguished names are all of these abbreviated prefixes here. We're going to call out a couple of the major ones. So DC, that is your domain component. We also have OU. That's your organizational unit. And we have CN. This is your common name. So basically, domain component, what domain are they associated with? OU, the organizational unit, what unit or department is within this organization that we need to denote. You can have different OUs going down the tree structure here. And CN, the common name, that pretty much IDs your person or object when you get down to the lower levels here of the structure. And these are basically attributes and a value. So the attribute and then the value associated to it. This gives us the structure for how we're going to create our distinguished names and be able to query the data a bit easier. So at a high level, we're thinking LDAP, we're thinking Microsoft's implementation of how they built Active Directory in general. We're thinking it's a large directory of all of our information, and we're going to be able to query it. It's hierarchical, and if you can kind of remember these three distinguished names for the values, for the keys that are associated, DC, OU, and CN, I think that's a great starting point to understanding LDAP and the different structures you can have working down the hierarchical structure that it's going to give us. So Microsoft's implementation of LDAP is Active Directory. Active Directory is going to store all the information about your network resources, as we mentioned, for user accounts, computers, printers, other network devices. We mentioned the buzzword hierarchical structure reflects the organizational structure of the network. It's going to consist of domains, trees, and forests. So now the buzzwords that we have for AD, we're going to include domains, trees, and forests, as that is how they are kind of structured out into a schema that we can relate to. Hierarchical, again, because it's LDAP. Now, when we go into defining domain, trees, and forests, the domain, it's a logical grouping of resources, represents a security boundary within the network, and it's going to have a domain name associated to it, like mycompany.com, mycompany2.com, mycompany3.com. The domain is your first kind of hierarchical separation within the grouping of resources to start separating them out into their own structures. A tree is a collection of one or more domains that shares that common namespace and common schema. So this is tree 1. You would have tree 2 over here. And the forest is going to be a collection of one or more trees that share the common schema, configuration, and global catalog. So if you have multiple domains, multiple trees, you now have your Active Directory forest. And a global catalog is distributed data repository that collects a subset of the information from every domain in the forest, used to facilitate searching and locating objects across the domains. Active Directory uses authentication and authorization to control access to network resources. It's the process of verifying the identity of a user. So authentication is saying you have the right credentials and you are who you say you are. And authorization is saying you have the right level of permissions to do something with that resource, or you're allowed to access that resource, etc. Active Directory supports a variety of authentication protocols, including Kerberos, that is the other buzzword we're going to remember. NTLM, yes, but I don't want to confuse you with moving into Active Directory, going over the domain. It's going to be Kerberos, whereas local authentication, I want you to think more of NTLM and LDAP, and it uses access control lists to enforce authorization policies. So we also need to cover the terminology of what is a transitive trust, as that is something that's implemented within Active Directory. So basically, if I am a user, and I'll call myself just A, and I trust another resource called B, but B trusts another resource called C, there is a transitive trust that gets established here. This is the transitive trust that A, myself, will trust C. That is the basic definition of a transitive trust. Now think of how you can apply this basic knowledge to different levels within Active Directory. If this resource in Active Directory trusts B and B trusts C, this resource will automatically trust C. It doesn't need to re-authenticate or go through all the jumps and hurdles to make sure it's a trusted resource. It will leverage transitive trusts within Active Directory to establish that trust and be good to go. A basic trust is just A to B or B to C. So important to cover that there. We also covered group user IDs and security IDs. Those are things that we want to think about as well for how Active Directory is going to start implementing authorization for what you can do. We're going to cover GPOs, group policy objects, here as well shortly. And Active Directory is a great schema to use when you're using Windows, obviously, to handle authentication and resources, managing your users over the network. But another thing to make you aware of, in the cloud, Microsoft, Windows in the cloud, they have their solution called Azure, and it's going to be able to do all the things that it's doing on-prem in the cloud. And just wanted to make you aware that traditionally, when we thought of Active Directory, we're thinking of on-prem as a great way to manage all the access to resources, etc. But moving to the cloud, Microsoft has rolled out Azure, so now they're running AD in the cloud for cloud-based solutions. And if we're covering Windows, we definitely need to cover, Azure as the leading cloud provider. You pretty much have Google Cloud Platform for Google, AWS for Amazon Web Services, and then Azure is Microsoft's cloud environment. So I think this is a good starting point for Active Directory. If you can be aware of domains, trees, and forests, and kind of remember this little image over here, and if you can remember transitive trusts, if you can remember hierarchical, and think Kerberos for the authentication for Active Directory, I think you will be all set. And maybe one more terminology that we've covered that you should definitely be aware of is the DC, the domain controller. That is what's actually going to respond to authentication requests. So when we talked about authentication over here and authentication protocols of Kerberos, we want to be thinking all of that activity is going to be occurring on the domain controller. That's what's going to be responding to the authorization requests within AD. And when we cover Kerberos later on and domain authentication, we'll be sure to bring up the domain controller again. Active Directory is rough. I mean, we could spend hours going over all of the intricacies within this. I think at a high level, we've got the buzzwords out there, and we're developing a good starting point for you to then go on and watch hours worth of content on Active Directory. I would definitely have a strong understanding of it, as it might be an interview question to just say, tell me everything you know about Active Directory. And if you can throw out all the concepts that we're covering here, I think that would be a great answer for someone trying to transition into the field. All right, group policy objects. These are a feature of Active Directory that allow administrators to define and enforce policies for users and computers in the network. So GPOs, this is basically how we make IT admins happy. GPOs allow a central place for IT administrators to go in and assign what you can and can't do in Active Directory. So because Active Directory has this hierarchical structure assigned to it, if we have different user groups at the bottom, or even as granular as the user themselves, we can say, okay, the GPOs set in this group for HR are allowed to access only files related to HR to perform their functions, while over here, the security team is allowed to have their own GPOs, and maybe they're allowed access to additional tools or resources that are potentially more detrimental if they're in the hands of someone who's not familiar with how to use them. So we'll allow our security team to be able to have certain access and allow them to have the authorization to use those tools and implement them, while over in HR, they don't know anything about IT, so we really can't have them perform such actions or have access to those resources at all. That's basically all it is. GPO. Can you do something or can you not do something? And we're going to assign it. We're going to go into the group policy management console here. As you can see, it might be a little bit small, but your group policy objects, you go in, you make the policy and the setting, and then you apply it to your users and groups or computers, and it's a feature within Active Directory itself. So if we just kind of read over the bullets here, it contains a collection of settings and configuration options that can be applied to users' accounts and computer accounts within a domain in the OU, organizational unit, Remember, that's just the unit or department within the hierarchical structure. They can be used to manage a wide range of settings, such as security, your desktop settings, software installation and maintenance. Everything can be done through GPO. You can push out, software through GPO as it's already defined in what groups would need that software at the OU level. They're processed in a specific order that determines which settings can take precedence over others. Order is defined by the domain, site, organizational unit, and then the individual user or computer account if you want to be that granular. The buzzword, a powerful tool for enforcing security policies and ensuring consistency across a Windows-based network. That's it. They require careful planning and testing to avoid unintended consequences or conflicts with other settings or applications. It takes an experienced Windows administrator to set up a GPO or an object. They have to be familiar with your whole structure in Active Directory, or at least the domain that they're working in. Is managing GPOs an advanced skill to have? No, but the knowledge required around what you're doing and what that can affect to your organization at the domain level is. So anyone can go into group policy management and right click and make a new policy and push it out, but the knowledge that you're having is, what is that policy going to do for the change? Is it going to be implemented correctly based on how the other structures are assigned? And if you can just remember, it's a way to have a centralized repository for management, for your IT admins to control access to resources, configuration settings, software push out, etc. It's a tool enforcing security policies across the network, and it's a feature within Active Directory. You should be good to go. You're definitely going to hear the term GPO pushed out a lot. It's something you need to be familiar with, and it might be something that you do within your first role if you land a job in IT. And also, a picture helps. So here, just a simple hierarchical structure of starting at the domain level, working down, administrative tasks, easily delegated for John, Michael, Tom, Richard, what they can access, what they can't, moving down the tree into the user or group level or a specific computer or printer shared resource. Moving into group policy, we have group policy 1 here for the settings applied to the users groups, or this can be an organizational unit. We have GPO 2 over here, and you would have a domain. You would start going down to your different common names or organizational units and work further down until you have the specific user or resource, or leave it at the group level. So hopefully this picture just gives you a nice representation of the hierarchical structure, what's involved in Active Directory, etc. All right, domain login process. So we covered what it looked like for a local authentication, and remember we leveraged kind of a similar picture, and we had LSAS go out and verify against the security account manager at a local level for if it was approved or not for the credentials, and it kicked it back and you would launch in. The biggest difference here with the domain process is we are no longer thinking about the security account manager. We are thinking at the domain level now, and we are moving towards Active Directory, and we're thinking Kerberos. So let's walk through the slide. First, the user is going to press Control-Alt-Delete, and that is going to initiate their interactive logon session. The Windows logon.exe is going to start the logon UI.exe, and this will have your user prompt for your username and your password. You will put in your username and password. LSAS will kick off, and it will go to, it's really going to go to Kerberos, DLL, and it's going to have that authentication process to send those user credentials to the domain controller. This big yellow box here, this is the DC, the domain controller. And if you remember, that is the item, that is the server that is going to respond to the authentication requests. So now when you go over and we have LSAS carrying over your credentials, it's going to go to Kerberos and it's going to go to the domain controller, which is running Active Directory on top of it. And Active Directory is going to live on the whole machine that is the domain controller. The domain controller's lsas.exe is going to use another DLL to verify the credentials within Active Directory. It will also perform the check or no-go for if the credentials are authenticated or if they are not. If the credentials are a match, the DLLs involved are going to return the relevant information to the workstation. So going back, this should be, I guess 5. That doesn't really count as 5. It's fine. We can leave this. It should be 5 over here. But anyways, the credentials are going to be returned and the access token is going to be on the way back and it's going to be passed back to the workstation. So now we're over here where the access token is passed back to winlogon.exe. The workstation is going to then have the access token within winlogon.exe. Since they've already been authenticated and approved, winlogon will launch userinit.exe, and then userinit.exe will launch your explorer.exe, and it will also contain a copy of that access token, and you will launch into your desktop workstation by loading up explorer.exe. So the big takeaways here for a domain logon process, we're going to be leveraging Kerberos, and we're still using LSAS. We're going to reach out to Active Directory, which is going to live on the domain controller. And those are probably the two biggest changes here, moving away from the security account manager, moving into the authentication mechanism for Kerberos in Active Directory. All of the other process names and steps that you take are the same. The biggest change is just from step 3 to what happens over here on the right for what's being authenticated is the biggest change. So the general steps are all there with just the buzzwords now of a domain. We're thinking Active Directory. We're thinking where Active Directory resides, which is on the domain controller, and what authentication mechanism is involved for verifying the credentials is going to be Kerberos. So hopefully that's not too bad. If you could draw this out and compare it to the local authentication process, I think if you were to draw it out 2 or 3 times, probably wouldn't forget it. And it is definitely going to be extremely beneficial for you to understand the difference between a local logon process and over the network domain login process. All right. My attempt to explain Kerberos. This may take a few times for me to get it right, but we're going to do our best here. It all comes down to having the right analogy that works for you. So I've been in the field for 8 years now. I've had Kerberos explained to me multiple times, and I can honestly say it didn't fully click until I had the right analogy of the carnival given to me when I was studying for my CISSP, and I took the Cyber course offered by Kelly Henderhan. Thank you so much, Kelly. This was exactly what I needed to never be able to forget how Kerberos works. And I have to give all of the credit where credit is due to Kelly and the Cyber team there for having that one module that covers Kerberos. It could be an interview question that you get. That would be crazy if you're going for an entry-level position and they're like, explain Kerberos to me. You know, my reply would be, well, how much time do you have? But if you can stick with the right analogy and understand this at a high level without getting into all the intricate workings of what hashing algorithm is in place for the ticket and what credentials are hashed and where they get passed, we're not going to cover that. We're going to cover the basic analogy here of the carnival and how it relates to Kerberos so that you can answer the interview question in about 60 seconds, and the answer will be correct. So why is it called Kerberos is probably where we should start. So the mythological creature of the three-headed dog, if we have any of the Harry Potter fans out there, they had the three-headed dog. This is a terrible drawing, but Kerberos is the mythical creature of the three-headed dog. For all the Harry Potter fans out there, that it's called Kerberos because it has three main functions, like a three-headed dog. So the three main functions here are in blue: the key distribution center, the authentication service, and the ticket granting service. And we will come back to this. But at a high level, you're going to need to remember these key items as they relate to the process flow. And if someone asks you, why is it called Kerberos? Well, that's where it comes from. So starting with the analogy, we're not covering Kerberos right now, we're covering the carnival. We are a user who wants to go to the carnival. If you ever go to the carnival, you go to the main window first to kind of get your wristband that will give you access to the entire carnival that you're going to. We need to go to this station first, and this station will give us a wristband. Now we're inside the carnival with our wristband, and that just gives us access to any food booths we want to go to, any exhibits we want to walk around to. But if we wanted to do anything extra, like ride a ride, we would have to buy tickets. And if we wanted to be able to access these, we would need to get, our book of tickets and rip it out. And maybe this ride is 5 tickets, this ride is 5 tickets, 5 tickets, etc. We wouldn't be able to just go and ride the rides with just our wristband. We would need tickets. We go up to the person running the ride, we give them our tickets, and then we would ride the ride. They would approve us for doing that. So if you can remember this analogy with the main concepts being you need a wristband and a ticket, it is going to help tremendously as we now try to explain Kerberos. So the first step here is we are a user on our workstation. We have a username and a ticket granting ticket. This is not an item in blue, but it is a term to be aware of, so it's making the slide. We have a username, and we need to get our ticket granting ticket. So how do we do this? We first need to have access to the carnival, so we go over to the booth. The booth's term is now going to be the authentication service, and we can abbreviate this as AS. The authentication service is going to take our username and password. It will say yes or no, and if the credentials are correct, it will return to us our ticket granting ticket. Now, what does the ticket granting ticket allow us to do? The ticket granting ticket is the wristband. It says we can now access the fairgrounds that we're going onto. We've paid our dues, and we've gotten our ticket granting ticket / wristband to the carnival. We need the wristband because where we buy the tickets at the ticket booth is obviously inside the carnival. And the next step that we are going to do is visit the ticket booth. We're going to take our ticket granting ticket, present it to the teller that's in the ticket booth, and say, hey, I want to be able to access different resources on the network. Can you give me tickets to allow me to perform those functions? This booth is now going to be called the ticket granting service. And this is one of the main components that we want to be aware of over here as it's in blue. So we have our TGT that gives us access to even go talk to the ticket booth, which is the ticket granting service. We can abbreviate that as TGS. And we're telling it basically, I need tickets to be able to go perform services within the network. It will say, oh, well, you have your wristband, so I'm authorized to give you tickets. So we will get those tickets and the ticket will make its way back. And now we are a user that has all of our tickets that we need, and we can spend them and use them as we want to. Now, when we want to say we want to go do the bumper cars, we want to access a resource, we can just say like a printer or something on the network. We are going to take our ticket and present it to the resource. And the ticket will allow us to access the job or function that we are allowed to do, because we've already gone through these authorization steps to say we're a valid user on the network. We have our wristband for our TGT. We've received our tickets from the ticket granting service. And now you can take your individual tickets and present them to the resources that you need. If you need another resource or access to do something, you now have a ticket that you can pass over to other resources. That is essentially how Kerberos works. It shouldn't be too daunting if you remember this analogy and if you remember the key components that are involved. So we covered the second one here as well for authentication service. So if you remember the booth as number 2, number 1 was the ticket granting service. The last part here of the three-headed dog that's important is the key distribution center. The key distribution center, if we can use another color here and draw a box, this is the entirety, all of these resources for where they're running is the key distribution center. So there's your number 3. So clearly you can tell the important part of Kerberos is not us, it's all the things that are involved that live on the key distribution center. So your key distribution center is going to run the 2 main components of your ticket granting service and your authentication service. Again, Kerberos, we're thinking Active Directory, an authentication mechanism. We have a key distribution center, which manages our wristbands and our tickets. And we've covered everything here. The service ticket is just this individual ticket that we pass to go around for different services. That is it. That is Kerberos. Now, some other items to just touch on. There's a lot of mathematic algorithms and encryption that goes on with the token being passed and verified at different stages in here. You really don't need to cover that right now. This is a high level, what can I present to you to get you to remember how Kerberos works kind of slide. But just be aware, this is a high level simplified version. We didn't even go to any of the mathematic tokens and the hashes that are involved at the different steps. And another, extra tidbit of information that I can share is that your tickets, they're kind of managed by your Windows administrator for whoever's running Active Directory to say, let's give this ticket an 8-hour lifespan. So when you log on to your computer, you go through all these steps, you're authenticated to the network, you can use your ticket to access different resources for about an 8-hour span. Maybe it's 10 hours. I'm really not sure. It depends on each organization's rollout. But this is so that, after your normal working hour day, if it's 8 hours, your ticket isn't going to be floating around there as an authenticated, approved ticket to access all the resources. It's going to force you to go through this authentication process again with Kerberos to make sure it's still pretty secure and has a deadline for tickets and an expiration date to ensure it's a bit more secure of a process. We wouldn't want to have infinite tickets authorized out there. When we get into high-level attacks, if we want to, just briefly touch on why understanding Kerberos is important. If you're going to move into the security field or cybersecurity, how can you possibly get into the concept of being able to understand attacks against Kerberos if you don't even understand the basic mechanisms for how it works? So some attacks you can have a DC sync attack, spinning up another DC, Kerberosting. You can have golden tickets, silver tickets, pass the hash attempts. all of these are concepts that would be their own hour lecture as well. The best resource that I can point you to is Sands did a great lecture on Kerberos and the attacks associated with it. So after you're able to draw out the steps here for how Kerberos works and remember the key items and buzzwords to remember for what happens where, I would definitely just go to YouTube and type in Sands lecture on Kerberos. And they have, I think it's like an hour-long video covering Kerberos again in depth. I think it's a little bit too in depth for someone who's never heard of it before to digest it in the first go. But hopefully after we've covered this slide and this topic, you'll now be able to go to additional resources and really dive into Kerberos, the authentication, the hashing that occurs, more intricate ways to discover how it's vulnerable to different types of attacks. You're now in a good position to go and do that. So I would definitely memorize Kerberos and at least this analogy and the process, and try and work out yourself. If I asked you on an interview, what is Kerberos? You can give me the answer. Kerberos is a authentication mechanism leveraged by Active Directory, which is proprietary to Windows authentication for authenticating over the network. It's called Kerberos because of the mythological creature that was a three-headed dog, and the three main components to it are the key distribution center, which make up the ticket granting service, and the authentication center, and that's it. That would really be all you need to say. Another buzzword is it's a ticket authentication mechanism instead of a exchange of a handshake for authenticating. It's going to leverage tickets instead, and that would be a really great answer. And then if they asked you any follow-up questions for explain how the authentication service is different from the ticket granting service, you should still be able to answer that. Whereas, the authentication service is your access to the carnival, and you don't have any access to resources just going through the authentication service. You would need to also go to the ticket granting service to receive your service tickets to be able to access resources. So I hope that was a good long ramble. If you have follow-up questions, we're available in Discord, or if we need to cover a Discord free session on going in depth to Kerberos and answering questions, we'd be happy to do so. But go check out that Sands resource and make sure you have a strong understanding of Kerberos. Congratulations through making it through the Windows module. It is definitely a beast, but extremely beneficial.